Working good. Everyone can hear. Hi, I'm Nico. I'm here to talk about Blitz. If you were here for the previous two talks, had a talk about Dioxys and then a talk about Flutter. And Blitz sits somewhere in between. It is from the same company as Dioxys. They're designed to work together, but it is a native renderer for Dioxys. So Dioxys, the original version, targets the web. It renders to the DOM. And there is also now a version that targets a web view using Towery. And then Blitz is new. It's only been under development for about 6 months, but it is a native GPU renderer, kind of similar to Flutter, but for Dioxys code. It actually could be targeted. It's not Dioxys specific. It could be targeted by other frameworks as well, but currently what we have is Dioxys integration. Okay, so I've got a slide about me, and I'm going to talk about Blitz. Now, Blitz itself is basically a web view, a very highly modular web view, except without JavaScript. So it renders HTML and CSS, and it is designed to be flexible so that if you wanted to build your own web engine or web view that's slightly different, that does different things, different layout, different whatever, you can take Blitz and pull out bits and mix them. And then I'm going to talk about Dioxys native, which is the Dioxys integration with Blitz, which is what you can use to, out of the box, build an app. Like, you don't have to pull everything together. Everything is all in a package for you. So my name is Nico Burns. I'm from the UK. I've been, for the last year, working on the Rust UI ecosystem and a bit on the Servo web browser as well. Primarily Blitz, which is what I'm talking about today, and Taffy, which is our underlying layout library that does Flexbox and CSS grid layout. This is my second talk out of GOSIM. I talked at the GOSIM in Europe as well, on the state of Rust UI, and I was told that people might be interested in this if they didn't go to that, so I should mention it. But if you want to look up the state of Rust UI talk, then it's on YouTube or I think other places as well. And where? Bilibili. Yeah. Okay, so Blitz is a modular toolkit for building web engines. So by a modular toolkit, I mean that it is not monolithic. It is composed of lots of separate libraries that are all designed to work together. And this is quite novel for a web engine. If you look at something like Chrome or Firefox, or even a new engine like Servo or Ladybird, there are bits that you can pick out, but for the most part, it's all one blob, and you can use it to render web content, but that's it. So the selling point of Blitz is that it's really modular. And when I talk about a web engine, I mean something that can render HTML and CSS. So you give it some HTML, or maybe even some Markdown, and you give it some CSS, and it will render this, and you can interact with it. It doesn't do JavaScript currently, although that could be added later. So you can use Blitz for previewing HTML or Markdown files. You can use it for creating like a screenshot of a website, or just an HTML snippet. You can use it for like generating an image or a PDF. We don't actually have PDF implemented yet, but that's something that people have been interested in and we might build soon. You can use it with the Dioxys integration to make an app, which is possibly the case that is most relevant to this app development conference. It's also, because it is modular, it's very good for embedding in a bigger app. So if you want to embed it in like a Cocoa app or whatever, you can, or a game engine, you can render using your existing rendering toolkit. You don't have to use our renderer. And at some point, if it gets more developed, you may be able to build an entire web browser with it. But we're not there yet. So this is what you can do today. I'll just get out of the way so you can see. So you can see that for the simple use cases, the API is quite simple. You just like, here's a URL, go away and render it, please. And this is the server website. You can see we've got a decent amount of kind of rendering capability here. We've got text, we've got colors, we've got shadows, etc. I guess there are no images in this. Oh no, there's one image. So you can render web pages. You can, oops, what have I done? You can render Markdown. So the code for this is slightly longer because we're running it through a Markdown library first. What I think is quite cool about this is that this is running as a standalone binary, but it's not specialized to Markdown rendering. It's just compiling the Markdown to HTML. It's using regular CSS, and then it's rendering that. So currently, if you, and this is using CSS from the GitHub kind of styling. Yeah, so currently, if you want to render a Markdown file and make it look like it does on GitHub or some other website, you kind of have to render it in a web browser or a web view. And yeah, this gives you a way to actually get this kind of high fidelity rendering, but in a standalone tool. Oops. So yeah, I have a little demo to show you, which is kind of similar to what you've just seen, but I just wanted to show you that it actually kind of runs live, and you can interact with it rather than just giving you a screenshot. Yeah, so this is us rendering our own README file in Markdown. You can scroll. Where has it gone? Why is that not working? It's on my screen. Oh, is this a different? Here we go. I see. Oh, it's gone small. Oh, now it's gone big. Let's make that. Let's try that again. Yeah, so I think I need to zoom out. But yes, so yeah, it's the same. It's just the Markdown, but you can scroll through it, and maybe I should just set my screen up to mirror quickly, and then we won't have this problem. Displays. There we go. It's better.
Is anything possible? That means on the screen.
Yeah, and then so okay, I think this is working now. Yeah, you have a Markdown example there, and then the other example I was going to show you is just rendering a web page. If I can type it correctly. So this is google.com. I know you don't necessarily use Google here in China. You have your own search engines, but this is what I've been testing with because this is what I use. And I think like it kind of shows that we have a decent level of support for things, text rendering, etc. Okay, and I'll switch back to the presentation. Yeah, so that's, I guess, to give you an idea of where we're at in terms of progress. It's fairly early in the project, but we can render things at a reasonable fidelity. And so now I'm going to want to talk a little bit about the kind of the architecture of Blitz and also the libraries that we are depending on. Cool. So the core of Blitz is this Blitz DOM. This is a Rust crate. And there are some bits here that are in Blitz itself, but all these orange boxes are their own standalone libraries. So Stylo is actually the CSS and styling engine from originally Servo, but it's now also used in Firefox, which is really cool because it means that we have the full power of CSS. So we can pass any CSS that Firefox can. We support all the selectors. We've got media queries, we've got CSS variables, basically anything that a browser can do, and we haven't got quite everything implemented yet, but we will do. We'll also be able to do. Taffy is, as I mentioned at the start, a library that we develop ourselves, that I've been working on personally, that does our layout. So we have Flexbox, we have CSS Grid, we have a block layout. We don't have floats yet, but we're planning on doing floats. And one thing that I'm quite proud of with Taffy is that it's not just used in Blitz. So the Bevy game engine is also using Taffy for their UI. And a couple of text editors, Zed and Laps, are also using Taffy. And we've had some interest from other people of using it where they're not actually wanting to render web content, they just want to do UI, but you can still use this module and we can share that code. And Parley is similar, but for text. Oh yeah, and I guess I should, just say about Taffy. So it's quite similar to the Yoga library that React Native uses for doing layout. But basically we're better than them. Yoga only does Flexbox, and it also doesn't completely match the spec. There are things like automatic minimum sizes that it just doesn't do. But we do Flexbox, and we do CSS Grid, and we do block, so it really means you can just render your regular web code, and it will all just work. Maybe not quite all, but it's close. And we're looking at doing running the web platform tests. So currently we just have our own test suite, but if we run the web platform tests and we compare ourselves against mainstream browsers and really make sure that we're competitive and rendering accurately. Parley is a text library, so it does text, it does proper shaping and BiDi, so we have full support for all scripts, which is obviously important. And it also does inline layout. So if you want to have images or inline block divs inside your text, then you can, and that will work. And we're also using it for text editing and input. That is a little bit of a work in progress. It's not quite ready yet. Things like IME work, but they don't work very well. But hopefully in the next kind of few months, we'll get that ironed out. And this is being built on top of some code from Google Fonts, which does the kind of low-level font passing, which is also being used in Chrome, which is very cool. And then the final library I want to mention is AccessKit, which does accessibility trees on native platforms. It's a very cool library. It means that we only have to write our kind of accessibility tree integration code once, and it works across all of the platforms. So anyway, this Blitzdom is the core, and what you'll notice is not here is anything to do with rendering. This is like the wider thing. So you can use the the layout and the styling, and you can use that in a headless way you want. You can input your HTML, or you can create your DOM tree using the Rust-based API if you prefer. And you can then get out of that the resolved styles, the resolved layout, and render that yourself if you want to. Or you can use the renderer that we've developed, which is based on this library called Velo, which will render that to a window or to an image. But yeah, the idea is that is then very composable, and you can bring your own renderer, whether that's just using a different graphics library, like for example Skia or WebRender, or I guess Impeller if you wanted to, or if you want to actually render something completely different, like render to a PDF and actually have vector graphics and proper text in your PDF, or render it into a game engine using the same shaders that you're using to render your game, then you can. We also have modular components for things like networking. So we have our own networking layer, which will go and do an HTTP request or fetch something from the file system. But if you want to bundle things together and have a networking system that actually goes and fetches an asset from your proprietary bundle format, then you can. And that will all work. And there's also a bunch of modules that are actually not currently modular in the implementation that we have, but we're hoping that they will become so in future. And then just at the top layer, yeah, you have kind of integrations that pull everything together, because as nice as having modular architecture is, like if you just want to build an app or you just want to preview a markdown file, you don't want to have to put it all together yourself. And there are, yeah, a couple of use cases, which these grayed out ones, which we haven't implemented, but which you could, or we could. Yeah. And another advantage of doing everything in a modular way is to kind of optimize for binary size and memory usage. So if you render using a web view today, like a web view is a big thing. I think Chrome is like hundreds of megabytes. Flutter is good for that too. It's quite small. But we really want you to be able to customize our kind of web view rendering layer based on exactly what your app needs. So if you render SVGs, then you should include the SVG renderer. But if you're not using SVGs, then you should be able to cut that out. If you're not using table layout, then why should you ship that in your app? Image formats. We support probably 12, 20, 15 image formats, but probably you're only using 2 or 3. So you should only ship the image formats that you need, etc. There's also the possibility of adding like extra rich functionality to a web renderer. So there are things like HTMX, which are typically implemented as JavaScript libraries. But it would be cool if you could build a browser that had that functionality just natively built in. And we think that Blitz provides a good platform for people to do that without having to build the whole rendering engine, the renderer, the layout, the style from scratch. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to mention our approach to how we're dealing with the libraries that we're using. So to start with, we're building on a lot of libraries, and we're not just building our own libraries. We're using libraries that other projects are also using. So I mentioned we have a few dependencies from the Servo/Firefox, the Stylo, the style engine, also WGPU, which the Velo renderer is built on, and HTML5ever, which is the HTML parser from Servo. We have components from the Line Bender organization. which is also somewhat associated with Google, but is an open source organization. And we have the text engine, Parley, from them. We have Velo, which is very high performance GPU rendering. They're also funding AccessKit, the accessibility library. Taffy is kind of mostly developed by us, but we're also sharing it with Bevy, and we get some contributions from them as well. And we're also using Winit for windowing, which pretty much everyone in the Rust UI space uses. And yeah, we're trying to actively contribute back to these libraries and not just be like, it's either our code or we're not interested and we'll just use it. And then where there isn't a library available, we're trying to make it available and be a community library rather than just one that is only useful to us. Yeah, so where are we with this? We have kind of alpha, like it is usable. You've seen that it works, it renders stuff, but there are bugs, there are missing things. This screenshot here is, this screenshot here, the Alista part 1, this is reasonably good, right? There's a bit of something weird going on with this menu, which is supposed to be along the top, but that's because we don't have floats. But everything else is pretty good. Whereas this one is Reddit. This is the Rust Reddit, and it's pretty bad. It's also partly bad because we're missing floats, and so the sidebar and the main bit should be next to each other. But even so, not great. So we've got a bit of work to do. It's quite a new project, but we think in a kind of a timeline of 6 to 12 months, we'll have something that you go to a web page that doesn't use JavaScript, and it will look kind of like it should. Yeah, and there's also quite a bit of performance work to be done. Some of the modularity is not quite there yet. So, I don't know, just to set expectations of where we're at. Like, if you want to go and build an app with this tomorrow, maybe not. But come back in 3 months and maybe we'll have something you can use. And this is our roadmap. Well, possibly subject to some discussion, but anyway. So one of the things we want to do is just make it more stable and robust. We're using the Stylo engine from Server and Firefox, but that's not very well documented. So when you change and update the DOM, making sure that that's actually reflected in what you see. There's some work that needs to be done around that. We've got a bunch of layout stuff to do. I mentioned float, but we also want to do calc, so you can do like mixtures of percentages and fixed things. We haven't implemented Z-index properly. You can't do position fixed currently. And then also direction and writing mode for bidirectional testing, also vertical. We do have support for bidirectional text, but we don't support direction for Flexbox currently. One of the main things is making sure that input and interactivity are working properly. So we have some basics for this. We have clicks, we have scrolling, we have some kind of pretty basic text input, and it kind of works. But we really need to invest in making sure that every single event works and that it works robustly, and all the events fire in the right order that you expect for the web. So that's something we're hoping to do over the next few months. We also need to make sure we have all the form controls. So currently we have text input and we have checkboxes, but we don't have drop-down and select or radio buttons or file inputs, and they all need to work. Finally, we want to do nested documents. So we have a Dioxys document currently, which allows you to dynamically render to Blitz using Dioxys, which you saw earlier. And we have an HTML document, which allows you to give it an HTML string and link CSS resources and render a web page, but you can't use both together. And what we think would be really cool is if you could embed the web page inside the Dioxys, and then you get a browser UI written using Dioxys, and then you're also rendering the web page. And finally, we've started with quite a web-centric approach. We're rendering a web, and it just looks like it does in a web view or in Chrome, and that's great, it's impressive, but then why not just use a web view? So we really want to look at getting some native widget integrations. Our architecture is kind of set up for this, but we haven't actually done it. So we want to do it so that you can, embed a native widget if you want to, and have access to all the richness of the native APIs that, this should allow. And then, longer term, some possibilities are like actual JavaScript APIs, so you really have a full browser experience. Compositor integration, so that, if you want to pull in content from other apps or videos and things, that will all work. And things like really tightly integrating with mobile widget APIs, so like the navigators on iOS, for example. There's a lot of potential to kind of really have the best of what something like React Native provides, but also have the web stuff. And it's not an either or. Whether that works out or not, we'll have to see, but the potential is there. Okay, so that was Blitz. And now I have a little bit on Deoxys Native. So Blitz is just the web renderer, right? And Deoxys Native is the integration of that with the Deoxys framework, which you saw earlier. So Deoxys Native is really something that is equivalent to Flutter or React Native or Electron, or these other kind of frameworks which allow you to build a native app cross-platform. So this is a screenshot of a Blitz app, and this is the code that produced it. Not all the code, because there's a bunch of CSS down the bottom, but you probably know what CSS looks like. And this looks pretty similar to what you saw earlier. It's just, instead of a Deoxys launch, it's a Deoxys native launch. We haven't completely integrated that yet. And our selling point for this is really that it is write once, run everywhere. Now, this is everybody's selling point. I need to expand on what's different about us. And I think that the main thing is that we can do web well and we can do native well. We will be able to once it's ready. So if you use like a web view, if you use Electron, or if you use Carry, or if you use Capacitor, then you can render a web app using JavaScript, and it's pretty good, but you're a bit limited in terms of what you can do with native integrations. And you can render on the web, and you can use the same kind of code. If you use React Native or you use Flutter, then you get this great native experience, but you're a bit limited on the web. React Native has this React strict DOM thing going on, but it's quite limited. It's just like quite a limited subset that you can render to both. Flutter renders to web, but it renders in a canvas, so you don't have the DOM, you don't have the accessibility and stuff. You do have accessibility? Yeah. The idea here is that Deoxys is native to the web. You can really render to the DOM. You need a browser that runs WASM, but that's pretty much everything these days. And then you can render the exact same code on native with some kind of progressive enhancement that you don't really get with a web view. I've got a bit of a kind of comparison table here. You can see Deoxys native is doing GPU or CPU, but GPU rendering. It's all in Rust. The layout is CSS. There's a kind of potential to extend CSS, so you add your own custom layout algorithms. Whether people want to do that is another matter. and it is using WASM on the web. And we plan to do native UI, but it's not there yet. It renders natively on a native app, but there's no integrations with the actual native toolkits such as Swift UI, etc. React Native renders using the native UIs. You have this kind of mixture of JavaScript and then Kotlin and Swift when you want to do native integrations. Layout is kind of more specifically Flexbox for React Native. Like it is web layout, but it's specifically this bit. You can't use CSS grid, you can't use block, you can't do float, etc. And the web is like, well, you can do a separate React app, but then you're not one code base anymore. Or you can use the strict DOM thing. And native UI, yes, like that's the whole point of React Native. Flutter is using a kind of similar GPU rendered approach to Dox's native. It's very similar in that regard. Scripting is with Dart, which has its pros and cons. Like, I actually think Dart is a great language, but the ecosystem's a bit more lacking than some of the other options. It does its kind of own thing with layout. It's like CSS inspired, but it's not quite the same. Which again has pros and cons, like arguably in some ways better than the CSS layout algorithms, but it's not what you're familiar with. It's more difficult to render to the web. And you're rendering to a canvas for the web. And I believe like you can include native widgets in a Flutter app, but it's not quite as oriented towards that as React Native is. But it's certainly doing it better than Docs is currently. And then you've got your other options here, which are like just web views. Everything tends to be in JavaScript, layout CSS, but you just don't get your native UI at all. And then there are a couple of other things down here which you may not have heard of because they're much lesser known. But I've mentioned them here because they're kind of more similar to us. So this thing called Skyter that a lot of antivirus programs seem to use as their UI for some reason, which is kind of doing a similar thing to Blitz and Docs as native in that it's using web APIs. In fact, they use JavaScript as well. But they don't have quite standard CSS. They do for CSS2 stuff, but not for Flexbox. And they're also closed source. So that kind of puts them in a different category. And yeah, finally, there's this thing called Ultralight, which is actually a fork of WebKit, but designed to be embedded into games. There's also, I think, source available, but not open source. Yeah, anyway, it's a thing. Okay, I have a demo of this as well. A couple of demos, in fact. Is it working? Yes, everyone can see this time. Excellent. So this demo is actually a little bit similar to Jonathan's because we didn't coordinate as well as we should have done. So what I've done here is I've run the command to compile to, oops, I've gone on to a different, oh dear, right, let's make that go away. Start this again. So I run the web compile and I run the Blitz compile. The web one is done, so I'm going to press O to open it. And it's going to open that in Safari. And then, so that's there. I'm going to pop this in the corner. And I pop this one here is the Blitz rendering of the same app. And I pop this down here. I'm going to open the actual app code. Let's open that first. Okay, so now we have the code, and this is rendering to the web. This is rendering to using Blitz, and I'm going to do the same demo as everyone else, hot reloads. So you can interact with this, and you can change things, and you can have it hot reload to web and native at the same time, which I think is quite fun. And there is a fun rainbow gradient that I prepared earlier. So yeah, that is quite a basic demo, obviously, it's just a counter. But I think it's quite cool that you can do this with exactly the same code. I mean, there's actually one line, so this bit here is the only platform-specific change here, and it's just, calling a different function. We're actually planning to integrate that so that, we'll still be conditionally compiled, but it'll be hidden from you. But for now, there's a little bit of conditional compilation, but for the most part, it's the same code. And then my second demo is just going to be, actually let's shut these off, otherwise it won't work, is just using Blitz. Gonna work? Yeah. So this is just to give you an idea of kind of where we are with the renderer. It works, but there are things missing. There's supposed to be a little button here, and there is. You can click it, but you can't see it, and that's because we've not implemented background images yet. Yeah, similarly, like these buttons, you can click and they work, but this one is not working. What is kind of working, almost, is IME input. This works, which is good. So we are not entirely naive. Like, we do have support for accessibility. We have support for IME input. We are trying to build a production-ready app, but we're not there yet. And there are things missing. And the biggest thing that's missing probably from Dark's native currently is, so this is using Blitz specifically for the kind of the application development use case, is event handlers. So we have some basic ones, but we need to build out the rest. And that's kind of what we plan to do over the next 3 to 6 months, at which point we reckon you'll be able to build a pretty good app with this. So yeah, that's my talk. Does anyone have any questions?